The desert evening breathed in long sighs, carrying the scent of mesquite smoke and the faint rustle of dry grass that bent toward twilight. Colors bled across the horizon, amber melting into violet, shadows stretching like old scars across the land. Beneath that sky stood Sierra, 20 years old, Apache by birth, daughter of hunger and silence. She pressed her palms together, whispering into the fading light words she had not planned to speak aloud. "I will cook for you every day, make me your wife." Her voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of years pressed too heavy on a young back. Who could hear such words in this wilderness, and what would they mean when spoken by a woman already marked as outcast? Dallas heard them. 30 years carved into the lines of his face, not from comfort but from dust, solitude, and the shame he carried like a saddle too heavy to throw down. His boots rested in the dirt, hat tilted low, yet his ears caught every syllable that floated across the evening air. He studied her as one might study a river one isn't sure is safe to cross, wary, hesitant, but unable to turn away. Why would she offer herself so quickly, so plainly, when the world had taught women like her to keep quiet, to hide in shadows? He did not answer, not yet. Silence was easier for a man who had been judged by every word he'd ever spoken. Sierra's dark eyes held a flicker of defiance, though her body trembled. She had lived through winters without firewood, summers without shade. Her people had been scattered, pressed against borders of towns that spat at their names. She had learned to survive on roots, on the thin mercy of strangers who bartered cruelly for her baskets and herbs. Still, loneliness gnawed more bitterly than hunger. To bind herself to a man was not desperation alone. It was a plea for dignity, for the fragile dream of waking each morning with purpose beyond survival. Yet as Dallas's silence stretched, shame rose in her throat like smoke. Had she asked too much of a man who owed her nothing? He turned away, boots grinding gravel, leaving her words behind like ashes on the wind. She watched him go, her hands empty, her voice retreating into the cage of her chest. But he carried the sound with him, unsettled by how it clung to the air. Dallas had always lived apart, half-blood among ranchers, mistrusted by white townsfolk, unwelcomed by the tribes. Years ago, a duel by the saloon doors had marked him further. Whispers of hot temper and reckless hand had never faded, even though he no longer raised his gun in pride. That loneliness was armor, but Sierra's words had slipped through a seam. Why did they echo when so many others had passed him by? 2 days later he found her again by a stream curling through pale sand. Her torn dress clung to her knees as she bent to wash, fingers raw from scrubbing fabric against stone. The water caught bits of moonlight, glittering around her like fragile silver. Dallas stopped, silent, watching the way she fought even the smallest task with quiet persistence. Without speaking, he reached into his saddlebag and placed a half loaf of bread on a rock near her. He didn't wait for thanks. He turned, ready to leave, but her hand caught the bread as though it were life itself, and for a moment her eyes softened, almost startled that kindness could fall into her hands without cost. He rode on, yet he felt her gaze follow him, a thread stretching between two people who had never asked to be bound. When Sierra next followed him into town, the sun was harsh, revealing every crack of dust on her skin, every loose thread of her dress. The streets turned cruel quickly, whispers coiled around them like snakes. Apache stray. Wild blood. Dallas kept his stride, shoulders squared, but he felt every sneer scrape across her face. Sierra lowered her head, but her steps matched his, refusing to fall behind. The space between them seemed fragile, filled with questions neither dared to voice. She almost reached for his hand once when a boy spat near her feet, but she stopped, afraid of what the town might do if they saw her touch him. Instead, she walked on, swallowing the sting of rejection that clung to her like dust. By the fire at night, the world softened. Dallas let her cook beans in his tin pot, mend the tear on his shirt with nimble fingers that worked without complaint. He never asked her to, but she offered, and he allowed it, not as duty but as a silent exchange. In return, he showed her how to guide his second horse with a steady grip. The first time she managed a short trot, laughter escaped her lips, bright and sudden. Dallas glanced up, startled, realizing he had not heard such a sound in years. From then on, gestures became their language, Sierra setting his plate first, Dallas ensuring her blanket lay closest to the fire. Neither called it affection, yet both felt the ground beneath them shifting. It could have stayed that way, quiet survival stitched together by small mercies, if not for the return of an old rival. Jed Carver, a rancher with a swagger sharpened by cruelty, spotted Sierra one afternoon as she gathered wood near Dallas's camp. His smirk carried the weight of venom. "So this is what you've come to Dallas?" he sneered, spurs biting into dirt. Taking in an Apache stray to warm your fire? His words lanced the air, crude and heavy, meant to shame. Sierra froze, her hands tightening around the bundle of sticks until her knuckles whitened. She had known mockery, but hearing it tied to Dallas cut deeper. Her worst fear unfurled. She was a burden, an embarrassment he would one day cast aside. Dallas's jaw hardened, his fists trembling. Once he would have drawn steel, ended the insult in blood. But years had taught him the cost of pride. He stood silent, turning his back on Jed's poison, refusing to give him the fight he wanted. Jed spat and rode off, laughter trailing like dust in the air. That night, Sierra sat by the fire, her voice low, fragile. Why didn't you strike him? Dallas's eyes stayed on the flames. Because you are not ashamed to be fought over, he said slowly, every word deliberate. You are the reason I stand taller. Tears broke from her eyes, unbidden, falling into the dust like rain on parched earth. She had never been called anything but burden. Now, in the stillness of the night, she began to believe she was something more. Under the pale glow of a swollen moon, Sierra cooked again, beans, bread, a simple meal glowing in the fire's light. She set the plate before Dallas, hands steady now. When she spoke, her words were no longer desperation but gift. I will cook for you every day, she whispered, not to be your wife but because you gave me back my life. Dallas lifted his gaze, eyes dark with something unspoken, and reached for her hand. He did not speak vows, for some promises are too deep for words. His nod was steady, his grip warm, and in that silence a bond was sealed, two lives no longer wandering alone. Sierra leaned into his chest, listening to the beat of his heart as the desert wind carried away years of loneliness. Dawn crept softly across the horizon, painting the land with gold and rose. Sierra and Dallas stood together beside their horses, the fire reduced to embers. Ahead stretched miles of open land, not empty now but filled with the promise of a shared horizon. Their story was not yet complete. Storms would come, judgments would linger, but something unbreakable had begun. Perhaps it was love, though neither spoke the word. Perhaps it was survival made gentler by another soul's presence. Whatever name it carried, it was enough to keep them moving forward. And if you, listener of this tale, ever find yourself heavy with rejection, remember this. The gentlest hands, the quietest kindnesses, can change the shape of a life. Sometimes salvation arrives not in grand gestures, but in bread shared by a fire, in laughter stolen under the moon, in the steady nod of a man who chooses not to fight, but to stay. In the end, Sierra and Dallas remind us that dignity, once given and received, can turn even the harshest desert into a land of belonging.